Hello everyone, welcome back to our course, Cultural Governance in the Modern Middle East. This is our sixth and final week, Decolonizing Heritage Studies. For today, we're going to be talking about this great article, Decolonizing Babylon, which I hope you enjoyed. I'll also be going through some possible ways to decolonize scholarship, so both historical scholarship on the Middle East and heritage management projects. And to do that, I'm going to draw some parallels between the readings discussed in each week throughout our course, particularly week 3 on the production of knowledge, and discuss how this relates to imperial and colonial power and how we can try to improve scholarship and heritage management projects going forward. So in our article for this week, Decolonizing Babylon, our authors consider local lived experiences associated with the site of Babylon in Iraq. And they do this to contrast with most scholarship on Babylon, which has been written from a Western perspective. Babylon as a site has a very important place in the Western, what's called cultural imagination. Of course, Babylon played a large role in the Bible, and a lot of classical archaeology in Iraq and elsewhere in the Middle East. One of its aims was to try and learn more about the cradle of civilization, so where Western civilization had its roots. And our authors point out what they call an apparatus of dispossession, which is the ways in which Western archaeologists and historians have alienated Iraqis from their own history and heritage. For example, they mention that projects of the World Monuments Fund must have an external supervisor or project manager, which typically is someone from the West, like US, UK, France, Germany, Italy. And so the reason I chose this article for our final week is that they are criticizing these traditional structures that are inherent in heritage management practice and historical studies. And they offer a lot of recommendations for how we can improve scholarship, try to unalienate local populations, and really improve history and heritage management projects going forward. So I'm going to go through some of the ways that you can decolonize scholarship. Some of them are mentioned in their article, some others I thought were equally important to mention, and so we'll go through them one by one. So what does it mean to decolonize scholarship? It means that you are recognizing the structures or tendencies in historiography and heritage management practice that reproduce colonial or imperial structures, and you actively challenge or reject them. And so this is exactly what our authors did in Decolonizing Babylon. And there are several different tactics or strategies that you can do to decolonize scholarship, which is becoming really popular now in heritage management practice and history writing, as people are realizing that colonialism wasn't just something of the past, but it's something that still has an impact today. And so there's several different strategies that I'll go through individually. The first is dismantling colonial structures, which I will expand on a little more in the next slide. There's also what's called research from below, and reading archival material against the grain. You can also highlight local responses to heritage management or historiography, which is what the authors of Decolonizing Babylon have done. And then lastly, encouraging scholarship by local people in the Middle East and in local languages. So Turkish, Hebrew, Arabic, Kurdish, and other local languages. So first, let's talk about dismantling colonial structures in scholarship. Structures in this context means things that have been taken for granted as true, um, that we assume, and then based on these assumptions, it reproduces conditions of colonialism. For example, I mentioned a few weeks ago the notion of Ottoman indifference, which was this assumption that the Ottoman Empire really didn't care about archaeology, heritage, or cultural objects. And this justified European archaeologists and museums coming into the Middle East and removing things and housing them back in Europe in their museums because they argued that they would be safer there outside of the Ottoman Empire, which was prone to neglect them. So Ottoman indifference is a colonial structure. It's something that was sort of made up with not a lot of evidence to benefit the West. And so when we argue for Ottoman indifference, we perpetuate this assumption that people in the Middle East and Ottomans didn't care for heritage, which of course is wrong. And when you publish scholarship or you work on projects that highlight how people do care about heritage, this helps to undermine that assumption and dismantle the colonial structure. Another really great strategy for decolonizing scholarship is to conduct what's called research from below. And so this highlights local experiences outside of the ruling elite. And generally, instead of using archives like government archives or letters, you would use what are called non-formal forms of expression. So things like newspapers, postcards, graffiti, poetry, things that highlight more of the lived experience. Because the average person in history is probably not represented in archives. What's represented in archives is more the logic of the ruling class, what the government wants to do, and not necessarily how the people responded to that and what the reaction was to certain policies. And so research from below really focuses on the local experience. Reading against the grain is kind of related to this, but it's based on archival research. So like I mentioned, archives generally reflect the interests of the ruling elite. It will be like letters or administrative documents about big important men and women. And this is good to understand foreign policy or what governments wanted to do. And so if you want to conduct history from below, but you have archives from a government or archives of like some major political leader or larger group, what you do is read them against the grain to highlight the stories that they weren't meant to tell. This is done in Europe, for example, by examining the use of specific terms. You might know the expression, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. And so in Europe, for example, during periods of political unrest, when there are protests, protesters will be represented in the archives as radicals or terrorists or revolutionaries, when they might just be people who don't have enough to eat and they're please asking for some more. When you don't read against the grain, when you just take the author's word for it, that, oh, there are some terrorists here, you assume that they're terrorists because this is the only information you're working with, and you perpetuate this assumption that these revolutionaries or protesters actually are terrorists. And so you say they're terrorists because the source said they were terrorists, and it just perpetuates in scholarship, and that's how these people will be preserved in history. And so it's important to think about who the author of each document was, what their interests are, why they're representing people in this way, and what stories the documents are trying to cover up. One thing that decolonizing Babylon really highlighted was local responses. In contrast to Western scholarship on Babylon, which focuses on its role in the Bible, its history, its ancient history as an urban center, and then 20th century, late 19th century, mid 20th century excavations. These are kind of the three main things that are highlighted in Western scholarship on Babylon. So what our authors have done is they've drawn attention to local responses and the lived local experience of Babylon as an urban center. Because much Western scholarship just tends to appreciate the site for its historical value and tends to ignore the fact that there are people living there, that there are people who interact with Babylon every day. And for them, of course, the site has a different value than it does for American archaeologists or French diplomats. And highlighting local responses is very important when you're decolonizing scholarship, because colonizing, of course, and the project of colonialism seeks to undermine people. And so we want to empower them and rise them back up. Our second last strategy for decolonizing scholarship is to conduct and encourage research not in English. Of course, English is sort of the lingua franca of especially the academic world now. You're more likely to have lots of readers, a bigger audience, if you publish work in English. But this really alienates people who don't speak English. And it means that scholarship and research centers, universities, in the English-speaking world will have more funding, more support, because they write more accessible research. But conducting research in local languages, Arabic, Turkish, Kurdish, Hebrew, would empower researchers who only speak those languages, which is likely to be the people working in the site that they're writing about. And it also means that the Middle East, the general public, has greater access to this research. The people who live in Babylon can go and read research written in Arabic about the place they live is very important. The final strategy that I wanted to mention is more large scale, sort of an overarching recommendation or something that we want to achieve, and that is the democratization of knowledge. We mentioned in a previous week how the production of knowledge has privileged those in the West, and democratizing knowledge is all about making sure everyone can access the knowledge that's being created. For example, our locals in Babylon should have access to scholarship being written on them and their heritage. This is a bit of a problem in academia because you might know if you are in university or if you've been in university and you need to write papers based on research articles, there are a lot of paywalls that prevent you from accessing this knowledge. You need to pay a subscription or have your university pay it for you so that you can access knowledge, which is a little messed up, that people who have more money theoretically are able to access more knowledge. That's not how it should be. And so let's all work together. There's not so much we can do right now, but this is the idea. Ideally, eventually, to ensure democratic access to knowledge production and to make sure that the people who need the knowledge, like local heritage managers and people working for these maybe smaller municipal governments who don't have infinite money, that they're able to read research being produced on their regions. So I hope this was interesting, and I hope it made you think a little bit about how we can decolonize heritage management and historiography in the future. Of course, there are probably ways that I missed, ways to decolonize scholarship that I didn't mention. So if you think of anything, if you want to discuss anything, feel free to email me. My email is here on the slide. And of course, share your comments and thoughts in the classroom. So thank you all so much for taking this course with me. I hope you enjoyed it. This is our final lecture. I would like to remind you that you have an assignment due 2 weeks today. It's a 1,000 word response. And if you have any questions about it, if you would like to talk about any material from the course or anything else, feel free to email me. I'm also really interested in the projects that you guys are working on. I know some of you are in university and some are professionals. Please, if you would like to talk about the heritage management or history projects that you're working on, drop me a line. I would love to discuss them and hear more about what you're interested in. So thank you again. I look forward to hearing from you.